You're listening to God, Law, and Liberty with David Fowler and Gary Humble. We're putting culture on a collision course with the truth.
Well, hi, and welcome to another episode of God, Law, and Liberty. I'm Gary.
And I'm David.
And, I'm excited about today. Well, I start every episode, honestly, by saying I'm really excited about. I guess I'm always excited by what we're going to talk about. But, David, I mentioned to you since we've been in this whole quarantine mode, not that I'm still working, got plenty to do, but, I'm looking to fill some part of my day and not be maybe at some point the kids. My wife's homeschooling our kids right now, obviously, and there's just a lot going on in the house. Right. And anyway, I stumbled upon some free courses by Hillsdale College. Yeah, and they have some courses on politics, history, various things. But the one I'm taking right now, and it's one of the ones they feature, is Constitution 101. And I just want to tell everybody right now, if you live in the United States of America, you should go to hillsdale.edu. It's totally free, and sign up for Constitution 101. I'm learning a ton. But one of the key principles, David,
and there are no tests, right? You don't have to pass to keep taking the next video, right?
No, you don't have to pass to keep taking it, but there are tests.
Okay.
There's a quiz. There's 12 lectures. Okay. There's a quiz on every one, and then you've got a final exam. But
Okay. But you can't flunk out of school.
You can't flunk out of school. So there's a safety net. Doesn't go on your permanent record. But one of the key things that stood out to me, of course, if you want to understand the Constitution, you have to understand what was happening in the Federalist Papers. And if you know any of this history, I'm sure you do, David, but our listeners, of course, we declared our independence in 1776. When 1777, we came up with this Articles of Confederation. And essentially that really didn't put in place a really solid union and a strong federal government. It was sort of, the federal government at that time was almost like a vessel of diplomacy between all of these sovereign 13 states, and that of course created issues. We couldn't effectively defend ourselves, from foreign wars and all that. But what Hamilton and Madison and John Jay, the writers of the Federalist Papers, the thing they pointed out was human nature, and that's what I want to talk about a little bit today. Human nature, and the crux of the Federalist Papers are, if I could put it in my own words, is that these guys acknowledge that people suck. and if you leave men to their own devices, we do bad things. There's good and bad to humanity. In fact, in Federalist 6, Hamilton said of men that we are ambitious, vindictive, and rapacious. And go ahead. You had a comment?
No, I was going to say he sounds a little bit like Thomas Hobbes, who says life is nasty, short, and brutish.
But it's part of the reason that as the framers understood the nature of man, is the very reason that as they were leading towards penning the Constitution, that we found it so important to put in a system of separation of powers and the checks and balances that we have. And I'll turn it over to you after I read this quote. So this is the thing that I emailed you that really got me questioning, especially with where we are today. In Federalist 55, Madison says this: as there is a degree of depravity in mankind which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust, so there are other qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence. So he's saying there's some good, there's some bad. But he goes on to say, Republican government, our republic, the government that we have, presupposes the existence of these qualities in a higher degree than any other form. And what he's saying here, in order for this system that we're putting together to work, in order for this republic to be effective, there needs to be more good people than bad people. You know, we need to operate. We as a whole, we need to be able to operate from that stance of reason and prudence and virtue and morality, and not our base nature of ambition and depravity.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I asked you the question. I was like, are we honestly today a moral enough people to continue the republic as the framers saw it? I don't know.
Yeah. I think my answer to you was no, or doubtful or something like that. And, actually, one of the things that needs to be appreciated is that we really don't know our own history to understand exactly what the framers were saying. They use words, for example, that on which we put a modern gloss that's not actually accurate. So, for example, in Federalist Paper 55, when he talks about the depravity of man, that is a word charged with theological content. He's not just saying, David does some bad things from time to time. The concept of depravity was the word used in the Reformation to describe the very nature of man after the fall of Adam, that he was depraved. Now, that doesn't mean that he's as bad as he could possibly be, but it meant that his nature is in total misdirected from being towards God, towards selfishness in himself. And so we are depraved in that sense. From God's perspective, we are depraved people. And therefore, our minds are darkened, as the scripture says. Our affections are twisted towards self-centeredness and all of those things you just mentioned, rather than towards God, as it was in Adam. And consequently, because our affections are pointed in the wrong direction, our will is directed towards the wrong things. So there's a whole bunch of theology just in that word depravity that we don't even understand anymore, because we don't like to think of ourselves like that. And this does not mean, though, we need to understand theologically, it did not mean that man could not do good, because the image of God was still in us. We still had rational minds. We could still think logically. And it wasn't that we couldn't come up with vaccines and fly men to the moon or any of those things, but that our minds naturally tended to focus on ourselves and what satisfied our personal desires and appetites. How much does the scripture talk about the heart, and out of the heart? So therefore, our will go in the wrong direction. And so they were saying, man is depraved. The image of God is not destroyed. He still has his mental faculties. When it comes to God, he's hostile to God. But that doesn't mean he can't invent an airplane. It doesn't mean that he can't do any number of things. And so that's why they had to have checks and balances, knowing that man's natural tendency, when left alone, when not under the law and not under God, was going to go in those directions where he would become a tyrant. And so that's why the founders, I think it was Franklin or Madison, I don't remember which one, said our government was created only for a moral and religious people. And it's wholly inadequate for any other, because we don't have those strong national binding chains to hold us down. It was assumed that we would have enough still goodness and enough of the religion of the Reformation to carry us forward. Well, all that's been lost. We don't even know what he's talking about when he talks about depravity, see, and the goodness of man. And so we've lost that, and now we just think men are basically good. The only problem with man is he has bad structures, and if you can just change the school system enough, or change the economy enough, or do all these external things enough, well, the innate natural goodness of man will flourish and will live in utopia, which actually was a theological word, I think, from Thomas More. That's where the word utopia came from. And they're wrong.
That's definitely our idea as I see it today is, if we can just generate, a good enough economy and take the pressure off of people, well, they're good. They're innately good.
Yeah, they're
they just want more.
Yeah,
really.
Yeah, that's right. It's kind of funny. I'll tell a story. I was in a committee hearing over TennCare, which is sort of our expanded Medicaid program here in Tennessee. This was back in, 2000, before I left the legislature. We were in a mess financially. And I had been pretty rough on the director of TennCare in a committee hearing. One of my Senate colleagues came up to me, and she said to me, I finally figured out what your problem is. I relay this story in my book, Politics of Loving God. But I said, oh, really? What's my problem? I thought, this will save me a lot of time in the psychiatrist chair, the psychologist chair. She said, you think people are basically evil and bad, and they're not. They're good. She said, I have a book or two that maybe you ought to read this summer. And I looked at her and I said, really? I said, well, I have a book I'd like to suggest to you. She said, really? I said, yeah, but you only really need to read like the first 3 chapters. That's all. And she said, what is it? And I said, it's the Bible. I said, because man is fallen and we're bent towards evil. And if it weren't for the restraining influence of God himself, or those chains that we put upon ourselves, which is what Jefferson said, bind man down. I mean, here's the rationalist Enlightenment thinker. And he said, I have enough of a biblical worldview to say you better bind man down in the chains of the Constitution. So see, she's over here thinking if we can just have enough of a Medicaid program to provide health care to everybody, well, we'll just all be hunky-dory good people. And then, well, I don't know why we have so much fraud in this system. We need to create fraud mechanisms.
And actually on that point on Jefferson, one of the things that really clarified his mind on that thought of man is the fact that he was the governor of Virginia. And and as a governor, he acknowledged that, he's like, what, if we don't fix this separation of powers thing and we don't have a federal government pulling these states together and bringing some sort of order, I could totally see how we're going to kill each other. I mean, he understood just being a governor of how that self-interest kind of takes over, and you're willing to kill your neighbor if you need to, kind of thing.
Yeah. So anyway, one of the things we'd hoped to do today was have on Dr. George Grant, who's sort of a hero to me. He's actually my pastor, but before he was my pastor, he's a noted writer and lecturer and speaker, historian. And we were going to have him talk about something I ran into out of our discussion about the framers and what their intentions were and the worldview that they came out of and the history behind the forms that we created. And but we had some technical issues. We couldn't have him on, so I'm going to be a sorry substitute in a couple of regards. But one of the things we've brought up over and over, and I'm sure we'll bring it up over again, is the Tocqueville statement that we've quoted many times. I have it here. It says, if the lights that guide us go out, they'll fade little by little. It's not like somebody's going to turn the light off all of a sudden, and everybody says, hey, we're in darkness. We better do something. Right. We'll go out little by little, as if of their own accord. And confining ourselves to practice, we'd lose sight of basic principles. And when those have been entirely forgotten, we may apply the methods derived from them badly and only able to make a clumsy and unintelligent use of wise procedures no longer understood. And so, what you're sitting here is saying we have this structure, but this structure was built upon a certain understanding of the nature of man that's dripping with theological content.
Right.
That if you don't understand that, you're going to make a clumsy use of the procedures that were put in place.
Right.
You won't know why they're put in place. And actually, this ties into a verse in Proverbs many times. Do not move the ancient boundaries. They're there for a reason. Don't go move them. Well, particularly the greatest offenders of moving the boundaries has been the failure of the church to articulate what the boundaries are, the failure of the citizens to understand the boundaries and the reasons behind them, and our politicians who don't know them any better than anybody else and misuse them all the time.
Man,
and
that's a key right there.
That's it. I mean, so, we're reaping what we've sown to.
Yes.
We've reaping what we've sown to. And look, I'll be just real honest. I will lay the root of the problem on the church. Because if your foundations are theological and those charged with being the purveyors of truth, I mean, how is it described in Timothy? It says the church is the pillar and ground of truth. We also know when the foundations are destroyed, the people perish. So who was in charge of keeping the theological foundations together of the understanding of man and the relationship of that theology to government? It was God's people.
Yeah.
So we're to fault. We don't need to point our fingers at any gay people or ACLUs or Freedom from Religion Foundation. We need to point at our pulpits and our pews that we've not done our own homework as Christians to know when our pastors are dividing the world into components and forgetting that Jesus is Lord over everything, that God's God over everything. And we've allowed our pastors to do it, and our pastors have been willing to do it because, it keeps people in the pews.
Right.
And it keeps them giving their money, and it pays my salary, and everybody's happy. And you heal the peace of my people superficially, saying, peace, peace, when there is no peace.
And
because man's hostile to God. That's right.
Today, how important it is that the church figure this out, and our right and good and true relationship with our government. I mean, we've got to get clarity on that, I think.
Well, yeah, we've lost it. And now the great thing about COVID is that it's causing us to think now a little bit. Wait a minute, can the government just say to the church, you can't meet? On what basis can it do that? How long can it do that? Why can it do that? Can it really do that? Can it do it at all? How does that fit with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment? And so perhaps this is God shaking all things again a little bit, so that at least for his bride, for his people, all that remains is God, because everything else on which we've relied is being shaken, and we'll come back to God. That's what I'm praying through all of this and the hardships. So, but anyway, I'm working on a law review article right now. I hope I can get it published. But I ran into this statement by Justice O'Connor, part of the majority of the opinion in a case called Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which is the last big seminal case on abortion.
That makes so much more sense now. You sent me that quote, which is a great quote, and you said it was from Planned Parenthood versus Casey. I'm like, well, how did that come out of that case? And so it was O'Connor. Well, that makes a lot more sense as to, she said that. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So here's what they say. That they've just reaffirmed Roe versus Wade 19 years later. They said we're going to keep the central premise of this notion of essential liberty to have a third party help kill our children. And they close with this rousing, sterling kind of statement. And when I read that statement several months ago and then reread it in writing this law review article, I thought, did this woman and those who signed her opinion have any idea what she was saying? It's kind of like using the word depravity and not understanding that the people at the time of the forming of our country were predominantly Anglicans, Presbyterians. They came out of the Puritan stock. They came out of the Scottish Reformation. And I thought, does she even understand what she's saying? So let me tell you what she said, and then we'll take just a few minutes to talk about it today. So here's what she said at the end. She's trying to explain why we are now allowing abortion as a liberty. And abortion had always been criminalized, if not on the part of the doctor, for sure, even on the part of the mother. The mother was a criminal for taking a potion, it said. So anyway, here we go. She says this: our Constitution is a covenant. Well, there's the word that caught my eyes. A covenant running from the first generation of Americans to us and then to future generations. It is a coherent succession. Each generation must learn anew that the Constitution's written terms embody ideas and aspirations that must survive more ages. We accept our responsibility not to retreat from interpreting the full meaning of the covenant in light of all of our precedents. Now, the word that really caught me there was the concept of covenant. And notice that she says it's also between the first generation to the future generations. It needs to be a coherent succession. Each generation has to learn. Well, what was Moses doing? He was saying, remember, remember, remember. I mean, when they crossed the Jordan, what did they do? They went back in, gathered up rocks, set up a memorial so that their next generation say, Dad, what do these stones mean to you? The story in Joshua. Yeah. I haven't told you. Let me remind you. Here's what these stones mean to me. So the concept of covenant, she's using that word, and I'll just bet you $1 to a donut, or whatever the expression is, a cup of coffee. She had no idea what she was saying and what our founders understood by the meaning of that term, because they had all been influenced by the Reformation. Now, this is not to bash on Catholics or any of that, but if you'll notice, the Reformation primarily took place in those countries. Well, in fact, it's the only place it took place was in the non-Catholic countries. France remained Catholic, Spain remained Catholic, but not England, not Switzerland, not Holland, Denmark, all those sort of Swedish countries up there. They did not. Okay? And so the Reformation took place, which was founded on the depravity of man that we've already talked about, his bent towards sin apart from the restraining influence of God and his mercy and his grace, and the concept of covenant. And what that covenant meant in the concept of covenant. Now, I'm going to read something that I hope people will find interesting. It's from a really good book called The Roots of American Order. If you want to read something that's, not a theological book, but a history book, but a good one from a biblical worldview. It's by Russell Kirk. And he wrote this. We've talked about law and the basis of law. And so he's talking about the concept of law and covenant. The law is not merely the decree of the monarch who may pretend to divine powers. Now remember, we've seen that throughout history. Pharaoh, all these people thought they were Caesar, they were divine. The law is not merely a body of convenient customs and usages that men have developed for themselves. Now remember last week with Adam McLeod, we were talking about common law was those things that we've learned over time, customs and traditions that run where the memory can't even remember we ever did it a different way. He said, well, that's not really it. The law is not an instrument of oppression by a class or a hierarchy, for true law is derived from the covenant that God has made and reaffirmed with his people. The law is revealed to save man from self-destruction, to redeem man from sin and its consequences, to keep man from becoming a Cain. See the depravity. His hand against every man's. There we go. To enable man to resemble the God in whose image he was created. Throughout Western civilization, and indeed in some degree through the later world, the Hebraic understanding of covenant and law would spread in forms both religious and secular. The idea of an enduring covenant or compact, whether between God and the people or merely between man and man, took various styles in various lands and ages. It passed into the medieval society through Christian teaching. It passed under the social order of Britain, from which the society of settlers came in North America. And he goes on and says that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are in essence man's secular covenant. So there's the theological content here between this concept of of covenant that we just don't appreciate. So let me give you just another quick example, and I'm no expert on this. George could have regaled us for hours on this, but most people don't know that the Westminster Confession was actually requested by Parliament. Now, can you imagine the Congress of the United States or the General Assembly of Tennessee saying, we want the brightest theological minds of Christendom to come together and help us understand the relationship between church and state? And their theology drove all of that content. Mm-hmm. Now, it didn't make the tremendous difference in England that it made in Scotland, but in Scotland, it made a real difference. And I don't know a whole lot about this history, but there was a group called the Covenanters in Scotland. And they took the Westminster Confession. They actually created a national covenant. When they joined back with England, there was again the concept of covenant that came back together. Many of those Scottish Presbyterians then came to the United States. And so the influence of Presbyterianism, Reformed theology, and covenant theology were the predominant milieu of the founding of our country. And so, for instance, one of the first documents every student learns about is the Mayflower Compact, right? We've all heard of the Mayflower Compact, or I hope we have. But it's interesting because it pertains of a covenantal structure. Now, most people don't understand that. They don't think about it. They just read the words and say, okay, that's cool. But they don't understand that it is structured after biblical covenants. It begins with acknowledging a transcendent source of authority, our dread King Sovereign James. Then it begins to explain the hierarchy. We are his subjects. So there's a transcendent authority. There is a flow down of authority to subjects. So we have God, transcendent source of authority, delegates to Adam to have an authority. He has an authority, but he's subject to a higher authority. There's then ultimately the ethic that God gives Adam. Don't eat of that tree. Ultimately, there was the expansion and the greater revelation of that covenant to the people of Israel through the Ten Commandments. But there was an ethics. And so they said, and we're here to frame such just and equitable laws as are good. There was the concept of succession. And there was the concept of oath. We sign our names to this. So you see, in the Mayflower Compact, if you actually had somebody that had a theological perspective that those people would have had. See, these are the people fleeing over here. These are the pilgrims. They're Puritans. I mean, they were dripping with this Reformed theology, covenant theology, and federalism. We'll talk about that in a minute. And so they framed their Mayflower Compact in the same kind of order with the same principles and precepts that they found in biblical covenants. So when Sandra Day O'Connor talks about here, each generation must learn anew the Constitution's written terms embody ideas and aspirations that must survive, well, she has probably no clue what those were. She would probably reject them as all myths and fairy tales, not fit for rational, intelligent, enlightened men. So what does she do? She makes a clumsy and unintelligent use of wise procedures by ignoring true law to come up with a law in her own head that it's okay to have a doctor kill a baby as a part of liberty of man. Now do we see the depravity of man? Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, so those concepts are hugely important, and most people don't know this. I didn't know it. I didn't grow up in this Christian tradition, but most of Christendom really believes in a concept, we don't hear the word very much, of federal theology. And I bet you if you ask people what federal theology is, they'd say, I don't know. I guess it's a belief in the federal government to save man. No. What it really has to do with is a concept, again, we don't hear much in church, which is called original sin. I bet you if you ask people what original sin is, they'd say, well, original sin is the first sin Adam did. He ate it from the tree he shouldn't have. Well, that was an act of sin. But original sin is the sin that separated us from God and broke the covenantal relationship between God and Adam. He creates Adam. He could have allowed Adam to just at some point withdraw his spirit and Adam would collapse back in the dust. But he says, no, I will be good to you, Adam. I have, and you'll remember we talked about this out of Thomas Boston's book, The Fourfold State of Human Nature. We talked about it early on. He says, God created us with the principle of righteousness. We were habitually righteous inside. We had that principle of righteousness in us. He made us in his image, and we were to act, therefore, righteously, a practical righteousness. And for that, we were given eternal life. God didn't owe us any of that because he made us. We could have returned to the dust and that would have been it. But God blessed us and he said, now I'm going to make a relationship with you. I will make it with you. You don't make it with me. I'm God. I made you. I will make a relationship with you. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to bless you beyond all measure because I've made you in my image, and eventually you will enjoy me forever. Just continue to act according to the good nature that's in you that I've already put, the principle of righteousness.
Yeah, and out of that book, wasn't that where we also talked about the concept of, is it coram Deo?
Yeah, living before the face of God, right?
Yeah, so that covenant sort of puts that in place. That's
right. But the concept of federal theology is that Adam didn't just sin, but he represented all men in that covenant. Now you might say, well, that's a silly idea. Well, go find some contract, some lease you've signed, some business contract, and see if it doesn't say that it binds your successors and assigns
and heirs and everybody.
Heirs, yeah, it's got all that.
I've signed a few of those, unfortunately. They're scary.
Yeah, they can be scary when you realize, okay, I have made a deal that's going to bind my great-great-grandchildren if this is still going on. Mm-hmm. So see, that was the concept that Adam was the federal head. He was the party with whom God made the covenant. Not that Adam negotiated it with him. Okay, God, so here's the deal.
This is what I'm going to do, God.
This is what I'm going to do, and now what are you going to do back? And we negotiated. No. God says, I'm going to give you something you don't deserve. You don't deserve to have eternal life just because I made you. You can go back to the dust, but I will. And there's only one requirement right now. You just need to remember that I'm God, that I'm the sovereign, and so I'm telling you, just don't eat of that tree. That's all. And it's for your good, so that you don't forget. It wasn't to punish you. It's for your good. Well, of course, we think that somehow Satan comes and tempts us and says, well, God's not really good. I mean, yeah, I know everything in this garden's really great, but you can't have that tree. I mean, how good could God be if he doesn't? Here's why he's not letting you do it. He knows you'll be like him. Well, that was too much for us, and off we went. But that's the concept of representation. So what do we have? We have a federal government under a covenant. See those concepts there? And we're saying, so certain people represent us. That's the idea of representation, of republic. But the concept of federalism unites, in biblical theology, it unites the unity of God with the diversity that will be of humankind. It provides a basis for unity and diversity. So what does our federal government do?
Yeah, it provides exactly that.
It does exactly that. Provides a basis for unity in those things that are national in character, but yet diversity with respect to any number of things that pertain to our day-to-day lives that aren't dependent upon our national cohesion. Now, that's what you're talking about, the Articles of Confederation. They weren't strong enough to really allow any cohesion. It's kind of like, hey, would y'all send us some tax money? I don't think so. No. So, that was one of the big issues.
Well, essentially, though,
Taxation.
as you were describing it, the way it made me think is, even as Christians and being in a covenant with God and in a covenant with one another, the way that we are able to relate to each other as believers in a fruitful manner is only with God at the center. I mean,
That's right.
We're relating to each other in a certain way because we're also each individually relating to God.
Right.
Right. So at federalism, and the way I look at that, based on that is, well, it's the same concept. The states are in this republic relating to each other in a certain way because they're also individually relating to the federal government. Without us all taking an oath and having a covenant with the federal government itself, well, then you wouldn't be able to have that kind of a fruitful relationship with each other, because ambition, vindictiveness, and rapaciousness would rule the day.
Yeah. Life would get nasty, short, and brutish. Yeah,
absolutely.
That's just what's happening. So anyway, we've probably gone on long enough today, but I thought it was important for people to when you mentioned your class to say, man, that's why we're doing this podcast. We want people to hear things other than rantings and ravings about Republicans and Democrats and whether China hit a virus or didn't hit a virus. Our problems go far deeper than what you're going to get on entertainment radio, on the political hot shows of the day. You want that stuff? Fine, go ahead. But we want people to dive into something deeper, because we're making a terrible use of wise procedures that we don't know, and we're not passing down a coherent succession to our children. It's been broken, and until we relearn it, as Justice O'Connor said, it's got its ideas and aspirations that have to survive. Well, they haven't survived, except among a few people. And if they don't reach a broader people, which is why we do the podcast, then we'll never get back on track. We just won't. And the answer to your question is no, we don't have what we need to really continue this republic. But that's where the church comes in. Because if it doesn't teach the theology that birthed this thing, that undergirds this thing, to help people connect the dots between their theology and civil government, then we will not recover the use of those wise procedures. We will not understand those aspirations, ideas, and we will continue to not pass them down. And that sounds like a glum picture, but I just think that I think through COVID, God's given us an opportunity to re-examine ourselves in certain ways and ask, really, is this Trump's problem, or is this the problem of every governor? How does federalism play into this? We've talked about that. So all this is great and good, and I hope our listeners enjoyed this podcast, and at some point we'll get Dr. Grant on. And
as we close,
he can give us more of those.
One of the things you mentioned about, like kind of forgetting where we've come from, and of course the Tocqueville quote that we mentioned earlier. Another thing that came out of the class that I had just never thought of before, oftentimes we think about the Constitution as a silver bullet, like if we want to pass an amendment, or if we just if we just do this certain thing, well, then it's going to fix everything. It's going to control everything. But the fact of the matter is that what the Constitution really provides for is the ability for people to consent to a government. I mean, one of the key things that came out of this class is that government is only legitimate by the consent of those who govern. So in other words, the United States government only has legitimacy because the people continue to consent to its government, right?
All right.
Right. But here's the trick. You can consent to good government, but people can also consent to bad government, right? And even though you're consenting to bad government, the government still has a legitimacy because you're consenting to it. So that's one of the biggest things I see, as well as we see sort of the dip and curves in our morality, and just look at progressivism and where we are in our country today. A lot of people, I wouldn't say most people, I'm not sure, but a lot of people support abortion and reproductive rights. So
they support find your own identity and go live it out and make everybody bow down to it.
All sorts of things. So it's not just about majority rule. A majority of people can consent to some really bad things. So that's why it's so important that we have more of a return and a restoration to who we were. And the fact that, like the founder said, this whole republic thing we set up, it's great and we love it, but it doesn't work for an immoral people. It doesn't preserve a good government if those who are consenting do not carry a level of morality necessary to institute a good and proper order.
That's
right.
That's
so
right.
Anyway, scary stuff, but hey, we're here. Listen to God, Law, and Liberty.
Pass it on to your friends. If you have questions that you want to ask us about any of the episodes, Gary, every week you close with saying, give us back your feedback, comments, questions, But seriously, send us some questions. Maybe at some point we'll just have we'd love to get enough questions to have a podcast just saying, here's a question we got to ask. Let's talk about it.
Q&A.
Question we got to ask. Yeah. So, yeah.
Well, thanks again, everyone, for joining us and listening. And like David said, you can email info@factn.org, FACTN.org, and we definitely appreciate your feedback. Take care. Blessings on you and your family as you continue through quarantine. And maybe you're listening to this podcast 10 years later and you're like, what in the world is quarantine? What was happening back then? I don't know. But all right, take care. Blessings, everyone.
If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to help spread the word, please give us a 5-star review and tell your friends to subscribe too. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you listen to podcasts. God, Law, and Liberty is a podcast of the Family Action Council of Tennessee. We are a 100% supporter-funded nonprofit advocating for family, life, marriage, and religious liberty. For more information, please visit us at www.facttennessee.org. That's FACTennessee.org. And please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram @FactTennessee.